Lieutenant Ethan Cole laughed out loud. Not a quiet smirk. Not a polite chuckle behind his hand. A full, open laugh, the kind that filled a room and demanded everyone choose a side. He was standing in front of Major Sophia Reyes's cockpit, and he couldn't stop himself. This is supposed to be the cockpit of NATO's most dangerous pilot. He turned to face the entire squadron. It looks like nobody has ever flown it. The room went completely silent, because everyone standing there knew exactly what Ethan Cole did not, and that silence was about to cost him everything. If this story already has you gripped, subscribe to our channel right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The laugh echoed off the hangar walls at Aviano Air Base, Italy, and for one suspended moment, nobody moved. 17 pilots stood in various stages of pre-mission preparation, some with helmets under their arms, some mid-conversation, some holding coffee cups, frozen halfway to their mouths. They had all heard the laugh. They all recognized what it meant, and not one of them said a word. Captain Dana Wills, who had flown beside Sophia Reyes for 2 years, looked down at her boots. She pressed her lips together and said nothing. Master Sergeant Kevin Ochoa, the crew chief who had maintained Sophia's aircraft through 4 deployments, turned slowly and walked back toward his tools. He didn't trust himself to speak. Colonel James Hartley, the squadron commander, stood near the far entrance to the hangar. He heard every syllable. He watched the room's reaction. He made a decision not to intervene, not yet, because he had learned something in 23 years of command. Some lessons could only be received when the student had delivered himself directly into their path. Lieutenant Ethan Cole, 27 years old, top of his academy class graduate of the most advanced fighter weapons course NATO offered, stood with his arms crossed in front of the most precisely maintained cockpit he had ever seen, and laughed as though he'd just been told the funniest joke of his life. He wasn't performing cruelty. That was the thing about Ethan that made it worse. He genuinely didn't know what he was looking at. He saw an empty cockpit. Everyone else saw a philosophy. Sophia Reyes was standing 6 feet away, a flight data card in one hand and a grease pencil in the other, reviewing the morning's weather margins with the same quiet concentration she brought to everything. She didn't look up when Ethan laughed. She didn't look up when the room went silent. She finished her calculation, made a small mark on the card, and tucked it into the sleeve of her flight suit. Then she looked at him. Not with anger, not with cold dismissal, with something that unsettled Ethan far more than either of those things. She looked at him the way an experienced surgeon might look at a medical student who had just announced with tremendous confidence that he already knew everything. Patient, precise, waiting. "Lieutenant Cole," she said. Her voice was calm enough that it carried across the entire hangar without effort. "Would you like to tell me what's funny?" Ethan didn't hesitate. He had never hesitated a day in his life. That was another thing about the confidence was genuine, which made it both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. "I'm just saying, Major." He gestured broadly at the cockpit. "Most pilots in a squadron like this, you walk up to their bird and you know something about them before they ever open their mouth. Lucky charms, patches, unit markings, something. Your cockpit looks like a rental car." He paused, letting his smile carry the point. "I was expecting something a little more legendary." The word landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Sophia studied him for 2 full seconds. "What's your kill record in simulation, Lieutenant?" 42-0 in the last evaluation cycle. "Your instrument rating hours?" 1,240. "And how many of those hours were flown without digital navigation, assist?" Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then tilted his head, recalibrating. "That's not really how modern training works, Major." "No," Sophia agreed. "It isn't." She turned back to her aircraft without another word. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. But for Ethan Cole, something had just begun, a slow, uncomfortable pressure building behind his sternum. The first physical sensation of a man who has just walked into a room and realized too late that he has badly misjudged what he walked into. He didn't feel it fully yet. He would. The briefing that morning was routine, a multinational coordination exercise between Italian-American and Polish squadrons, based at Aviano, scheduled to run 3 days across multiple airspace sectors. Colonel Hartley stood at the front of the room and walked through the operational parameters with his usual methodical precision. Ethan sat in the second row between two Polish pilots he had never met and spent most of the briefing watching Sophia Reyes. She sat in the front row left side, and she didn't take a single note. That bothered him immediately. Every other pilot in the room was annotating their briefing sheets, fuel loadings, communication frequencies, emergency divert fields, weather decision points. Standard practice. Required, actually. Colonel Hartley expected annotated briefing cards from every pilot before engine start. Sophia's card remained blank. Ethan leaned forward slightly. He studied her from across the room, this woman whose reputation he had heard about for 2 years before actually meeting her. This pilot everyone called Ghost, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She was 41 years old. She wore no decorations on her flight suit beyond her rank and NATO qualification wings. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the colonel, and she looked to Ethan completely ordinary. He whispered to the Polish pilot on his left. Major Kazimierz Brzezinski, a rangy, quiet man with a face like weathered timber. Does she ever take notes? Brzezinski didn't look at him. He kept his eyes forward. He said quietly, "She doesn't need to. Everyone needs to. She doesn't. That's physically impossible. You can't retain that volume of..." "She doesn't take notes," Brzezinski said with the patient firmness of a man who had had similar conversations before and found them exhausting, because she already knows what's in them. She reviewed the terrain data, the weather package, the communications plan, and the enemy order of battle last night, alone, before any of us received our briefing packages. Ethan stared at him. How did she get the briefing package before it was distributed? She asked for it. She asked Colonel Hartley personally 3 weeks ago to receive all mission packages 24 hours before the standard distribution window. Brzezinski finally glanced at him. He said yes. Ethan looked back at Sophia. She had turned her head slightly and was now looking at the weather overlay projected on the screen, and for the first time, Ethan noticed something he had missed before. Her eyes weren't passive. They were moving continuously, methodically, reading the information on the screen in a pattern he couldn't quite identify, as though she were cross-referencing it against something she already held in her head. The uncomfortable pressure behind his sternum got slightly heavier. I told himself it was nothing. The first flight of the exercise launched at 7:30. Ethan flew a 4-ship formation with 2 American pilots and 1 Italian captain, Lorenzo Ferretti, who was so good on the radio that Ethan had spent 10 minutes in the debrief just listening to his frequency management. Sophia flew as the exercise's adversary controller, which meant she wasn't in the primary formation at all. She was operating independently, simulating enemy behavior patterns, inserting herself into the exercise at unpredictable intervals to test the formation's response. This, Ethan had thought, was the limitation of her role. She wasn't leading. She wasn't in the primary fight. She was being used as a training tool. He understood this completely wrong. 22 minutes into the flight, without any radio call, without any electronic emission that their radar warning receivers could detect. Sophia's aircraft appeared directly behind Ethan's 4-ship at precisely the worst possible angle, a high 6th position inside minimum radar range, within guns range, and already within heat-seeker parameters. His warning tone sounded. He had already lost. He hadn't seen her once. He hadn't seen her approach. I hadn't seen any of the tactical geometry she must have been building for the previous 20 minutes to arrive at that position without any detectable signature. She called over the radio in the flat professional voice of an adversary controller. Bandit guns kill November 4. Time 0752. And then she was gone. Ethan spent the next 30 seconds trying to reconstruct how she had gotten there. He couldn't. In 12 years of flying, including 2 years of advanced fighter weapons training, he had never not been able to reconstruct an adversary's geometry after a kill. It was the first thing every fighter pilot did. Trace the lines backward. Identify the angles. Understand the sequence of decisions that produce the outcome. It was how you learned. It was how you improved. It was how you understood what had just been done to you. He traced and retraced and came up empty. Because Sophia had not used the standard geometry. She had used something he didn't have a name for yet. An approach that was simultaneously simpler and stranger than anything in the tactics manual, built not on geometry, but on a deep intuitive reading of how Ethan's formation was moving, where their attention was focused, where the natural gaps in their scan patterns would appear, and when. She had read them like a text, and then she had stepped through the exact page she knew they would leave unguarded. Over the radio, without any editorial commentary, she said, "Resume exercise," and the flight continued. Ethan said nothing, but the pressure behind his sternum was no longer quiet. That evening in the squadron's debrief room, Sophia stood at the front and walked through the reconstruction of the morning's kills with the same methodical calm she brought to everything. There were 4 of them. Ethan's 4 ship had been neutralized 4 separate times, each from a different angle, each using a different method, each arriving in the exact gap that the formation's own tactics had created. She used no dramatic language. She didn't gloat. She didn't emphasize the magnitude of what she had done. She simply showed them what had happened step by step, using the same neutral tone a surgeon might use to walk medical students through a procedure. And then she said, the formation made the same error 4 times. Not the same tactical error 4 different tactical errors, but the same fundamental error underneath all of them. She paused and looked around the room. What was it? Nobody spoke for a moment. Ethan, who had been sitting in the back of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, said nothing. It was Captain Dana Wills who finally spoke. We were flying the formation that was briefed. We weren't flying the airspace. Sophia looked at her for a moment. Expand that. We committed to a specific formation structure before we understood what the threat was actually doing. Every time the threat changed, we reacted inside the structure instead of adapting the structure to the threat. We were protecting the formation instead of executing the mission. Yes, Sophia said. Simple. Final. That is exactly it. She clicked off the display. We'll fly it again tomorrow at 0800. The formation changes. The airspace doesn't. She walked out. Ethan sat alone in the debrief room for a long time after everyone else had left. He was thinking about something she had said. We were protecting the formation instead of executing the mission. He kept turning it over. He didn't know yet what to do with it, but he couldn't put it down. 2 nights into the exercise, Ethan did something he had never voluntarily done before in his professional career. He asked for help. Specifically, he knocked on the door of Major Sophia Reyes' office at 21:30 after the evening briefing had ended and most of the squadron had gone to dinner. He stood in the hallway and knocked and waited, and for a moment he was certain she wasn't there, or worse that she was there and would simply not answer. The door opened. Sophia was still in her flight suit. She had a pen in one hand and a chart spread across her desk behind her. Not a digital display. A paper chart, the kind that hadn't been standard issue in most squadrons for 15 years. She looked at him with the same neutral precision she used for everything. Lieutenant Cole, Major, I wanted to... He stopped. He was not accustomed to the sensation of not knowing how to finish a sentence. He cleared his throat. I wanted to ask you a question about the morning debrief. She stepped back from the door. He walked in. The office was spare a desk. 2 chairs. The chart, a single photograph on the wall that he couldn't see clearly from where he stood. Nothing decorative. Nothing personal, at least, not in the conventional sense. But every surface held something purposeful. A weather text, a frequencies card, a small notebook that looked as though it had been written in until the pages could barely close. Sit down, she said. He sat. What's your question? The fundamental error you identified. Protecting the formation instead of executing the mission. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I understood what it meant analytically, but I couldn't figure out how to see it in real time. In the moment. When everything is happening at once, and you have 4 aircraft and a threat picture that's changing faster than you can process, how do you know when the structure has become the enemy? Sophia set the pen down on the desk. She looked at him for a moment, in the way she often did, not evaluating exactly, but listening to something underneath the question. "Tell me why you fly," she said. Ethan blinked. "I what?" "Tell me why you fly. Not why you chose this career. Not what your academy essay said. Why you actually fly." He opened his mouth, closed it. The honest answer arrived before the polished one, which surprised him. "Because when I'm up there," he said slowly, "there's no ambiguity. Everything is either right or wrong. The physics don't negotiate. The aircraft either performs or it doesn't. I can be genuinely excellent at something, and the measure of that excellence is completely objective." He paused. "On the ground, everything is political. Everything is subjective. Up there, the truth is always available." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "And what happens," she said carefully, "when the truth is no longer available?" The question landed in the room like a stone. Ethan looked at her. "What happens," she continued, "when your radar is lying to you, when your data link is wrong, when the picture your technology is showing you doesn't match the picture your eyes are seeing, and you cannot immediately tell which one is accurate?" He had no answer. And the absence of an answer told him something he hadn't known about himself 5 seconds earlier. He had never seriously contemplated that possibility. He had trained for system failures. He had studied emergency procedures. He had practiced flying without individual systems during specific training events designed for exactly that purpose. But he had never genuinely internalized the possibility that the picture might be wrong, because the picture had never been wrong. Not for him. Not yet. Sophia watched the realization move across his face with the quiet patience of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for 2 days. "That," she said, "is why you lost this morning. Not because your tactics were poor. Not because your formation was inadequate. Because at the moment when the threat appeared outside the structure, you expected your first instinct was to reprocess the structure to find the error in your planning, rather than respond to the actual threat in the actual sky. You were 1/10 of a second slower than the threat required," she continued. "In a live environment, that's not a debriefing point. That's a flag-draped coffin." The silence after that was the loudest silence Ethan had ever sat in. "How do you fix it?" he asked. His voice was quieter than he had intended. "You stop believing that being right means being safe," she said. "You start flying in a world where the information can be wrong, and the correct answer is still required. And you practice that until the gap between those two realities disappears." She picked up the pen. "Be here at 0600 tomorrow. We fly before the exercise starts." Ethan stood. At the door, he turned back. "Can I ask you one more thing?" She looked up. "Why is your cockpit empty?" Sophia was quiet for a moment. "It isn't," she said. He didn't understand that answer. Not yet. But he would. 0600. The next morning. The flight line was still dark. Sophia was already in her cockpit when Ethan arrived, walking through her pre-flight checks with the unhurried precision of a person who had done this exact sequence so many times it had become something close to meditation. He climbed the ladder to his own aircraft. They launched without a briefed mission card. No formal objectives, no debriefing scheduled. Sophia came over the radio once after they leveled off in the working area. "Follow me exactly," she said. "Don't think. Don't anticipate. Follow." What followed was 45 minutes that Ethan Cole would spend the rest of his career trying to describe to other pilots with limited success. Sophia flew without any detectable pattern. Not random patternless flying produces its own kind of predictability. What she produced was something different. A continuous, responsive, improvisational relationship with the airspace itself, as though the aircraft were not a machine she was operating, but an extension of something she was reading. She used altitude the way a chess player uses time. She used heading changes the way a musician uses silence, not as absences, but as emphases. She created and then destroyed geometric advantages so quickly that Ethan couldn't identify them until they were already gone. And through all of it, she never broke a single rule of airmanship. Every maneuver was within limits. Every altitude was coordinated. Every radio call was clean and precise. She was not flying outside the envelope. She was flying inside it in a way that made the envelope seem larger than Ethan had believed it to be. He followed as best he could. How was by any objective standard one of the most gifted young fighter pilots in the Alliance. And for 45 minutes, he felt like a student on his first solo. When they landed and he climbed down from his aircraft, she was already standing on the flight line, her helmet bag over her shoulder, reviewing the data card she had made the previous evening. "What were you doing up there?" he asked. "Flying," she said. "That's not an answer." She looked at him. "Yes, it is. That is exactly what I was doing. Not managing a system, not executing a plan. Flying. You will know the difference when you understand it." She walked back toward the squadron without waiting for him to respond. He stood on the flight line as the sun came up over the mountains to the east, and the uncomfortable pressure that had been building in his chest for 2 days spread outward and became something else. Something more like hunger. I wanted to understand what she had just shown him. He wanted it the way he had once wanted his academy wings. He just didn't know yet that what she was showing him would require him to take apart everything he thought he already knew. That evening, something happened that none of them had planned for. The exercise's communications network went partially down. A software fault in the coalition data sharing architecture caused 3 separate ground control stations to lose their data links to the airborne package for 11 minutes. 11 minutes doesn't sound like much. In a multinational coalition exercise, with 31 aircraft airborne, across 4 separate airspace sectors, 11 minutes of data link loss was a significant event. 4 formation leads declared emergencies. 2 Polish aircraft immediately diverted to the nearest available airfield. The Italian command post lost track of 6 aircraft simultaneously and implemented an emergency airspace deconfliction protocol that grounded the remaining formations. Ethan's aircraft, operating in a transit corridor at the time, found itself suddenly blind data. Link gone coordinating radio frequency, jammed by the same software fault that had killed the data architecture secondary frequency, carrying nothing but confused radio calls from multiple aircraft, trying to establish where everyone was. He made 3 radio calls that went unanswered. He checked his GPS. He checked his standby instruments. How was not lost. The aircraft's own navigation remained intact. But without the data link, he had no picture of where the other 30 aircraft were, and the exercise airspace was complex enough that proceeding without that picture carried real risk of conflicting with another aircraft. He made a decision. He climbed to a deconfliction altitude, published in the exercise's contingency procedures, an altitude reserved for aircraft that lost coordination capability and held there orbiting waiting for the network to restore. Clean decision. Correct procedure. Textbook. 6 minutes later, over the frequency that had been jammed, Sophia's voice appeared, not calling for herself, calling for him. She had identified from her own position in the airspace that Ethan was isolated. She had reconstructed from the pattern of radio calls and the last known position data before the data link failed approximately where he was and what his situation required. She talked him through a blind rejoinder to a safe coordination point, using only time heading and altitude. No data link, no formal navigation reference. Nothing but the disciplined application of dead reckoning in a complex and momentarily chaotic airspace. It took 4 minutes. When they were level and visual with each other, she said over the radio very quietly, "Good recovery, Lieutenant." It was the first compliment she had given him. I understood in that moment that it was not a compliment about what he had done. It was a compliment about what he had not done. He had not panicked. He had not frozen. He had not demanded information the system could not provide. He had used what he had and waited for more. It was a small thing, but it was the first thing he had done in 2 days that she had acknowledged. He held that acknowledgement in the quiet of his cockpit for the rest of the transit home, turning it over, examining what it meant about what he was beginning to learn. The exercise still had 2 days left, but in Ethan Cole's mind, something had already ended. And something else, something he didn't yet have a name for, had quietly, without ceremony, without triumph, begun. The exercise had 2 days left. Ethan flew them differently. Not better, not yet. Better would come later, and it would come hard. but differently. The way a man walks differently after realizing for the first time that the ground beneath him is not as solid as he believed. Carefully, with attention paid to places he had never paid attention to before. On the morning of day 3, Colonel Hartley pulled him aside before the briefing. "You've been quiet," Hartley said. "Sir. Since the data link event. You've been quiet. I've been watching." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond to that. Hartley was not a man who made casual observations. Every word he said was intentional, placed with the same precision a surgeon places instruments. "I've been thinking, sir." "About what?" Ethan considered the question for a moment. "About how much I've been relying on the picture instead of the sky." Hartley studied him. "That's a strange thing for a 27-year-old top-of-his-class pilot to admit." "Yes, sir. Major Reyes said something about you last night, in my office." Ethan looked up sharply. He hadn't known that conversation had happened. "She said you asked her a question 2 nights ago that she'd never been asked before. Not in 20 years of flying and 10 years of instruction." Ethan waited. "She said you asked her why her cockpit was empty." Hartley's expression didn't change. "She told me she finally understood something when you asked it. That the question itself was the answer. That a man who sees an empty cockpit and calls it empty has never learned to look at what isn't there." The words went through Ethan like a current. Hartley walked away without another word. Ethan stood in the hallway and thought about an empty cockpit for a long time, and then he went to find Sophia Reyes. She was in the flight planning room alone, working through the day's weather with the paper chart she seemed to prefer to every digital tool the squadron owned. She didn't look up when he came in, but she didn't tell him to leave, which he had already learned to read as an invitation. He sat across the table from her. "You talked to the colonel about me," he said. "I talked to the colonel about every pilot under his command. That's his job and mine." "What did you tell him?" "What I observed." She made a small mark on the chart. "That you're faster than you think you are, and slower than you believe you are." He turned that over. "Those aren't the same thing." "No, they're not." She finally looked up. "Your reaction speed is excellent. Your processing speed in a known environment standard threat. Expected geometry. Familiar dataset is exceptional. That's what your training scores reflect. That's what 42-0 in simulation reflects." She set the pencil down. "Your processing speed in an unknown environment, unfamiliar threat, unexpected geometry, corrupted or absent data is significantly slower. Because you've never trained there. No one trains there." "I did." He looked at her. "Not formally," she said. "There's no syllabus for it. There's no qualification course. I trained there because I was forced to. Because I flew in an environment where the data was wrong often enough that I learned to treat the picture as one input among many rather than as the primary truth." She paused. "Most modern pilots have never experienced a truly unreliable picture. Not in a real environment, so they haven't learned to distrust it. And when the picture goes wrong, they freeze, or they trust it anyway." She picked the pencil back up. "Neither outcome is acceptable." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "How do you train for that?" he asked. She looked at him with something he hadn't seen in her expression before. It was small and brief, barely a flicker, but it was there. It was something close to respect. "You start," she said, "by admitting that you don't already know." She turned back to the chart. He stayed in the planning room for another hour, reviewing the morning's mission on his own, and for the first time in his career, he covered his data link display with his glove and tried to build the picture using only his own instruments and the briefed information he'd memorized the night before. He was significantly slower than he expected, and significantly more accurate than he feared. It was the beginning of something. He felt it though he couldn't yet name it. The last day of the exercise brought weather. Not severe enough to cancel, but thick enough to make life genuinely complicated. Low cloud layers in the primary working area, reduced visibility on the approaches, a crosswind on the active runway that had already produced 2 aborted landings from the Polish contingent before the morning's first launch. Sophia filed her flight plan without modifying a single parameter. Ethan noticed because he was watching when she submitted it. He walked over to where Captain Dana Wills was reviewing her own plan. "She's not adjusting for the weather," he said quietly. Wills glanced at him. "I know. The working area is below minimums for the primary profile. She knows that. So why?" "Because she's not flying the primary profile," Wills said. And there was something in her voice, not impatience exactly, but the tone of a person explaining something they have explained before and understand differently now than when they first learned it. "Watch the altitude blocks she filed. She shifted the entire profile 1,500 feet lower than the published floor. Reformatted the entry geometry around the cloud base instead of above it. But the mission is identical, the path is different." Ethan looked at Sophia's flight plan. She was right. The mission was identical. But Sophia had reconstructed the entire tactical approach around the actual weather instead of the planned weather. She hadn't canceled the mission. She hadn't simplified it. She had looked at what the sky was actually offering and built a solution inside those constraints that preserved every objective. It had probably taken her 15 minutes. It had required a depth of systems knowledge and tactical flexibility that Ethan realized with a cold and honest clarity he could not have replicated in an hour. He said nothing. He went back to his own flight plan and spent 40 minutes restructuring his approach to account for the weather. It wasn't as elegant as Sophia's, but it was better than what he'd had. In the air, the weather was exactly as complicated as the forecast suggested, and then slightly worse. Ethan's formation entered the working area through a gap in the cloud layer that was narrower than briefed, and for approximately 90 seconds, he was navigating in reduced visibility with 4 aircraft in close formation and no data link confirmation of the airspace structure below him. He used heading time and altitude. He talked his formation through it quietly and precisely. I didn't wait for the data link to come back. He flew. When they broke out the other side, Sophia's voice came over the frequency. "Good formation lead, November 1. He said nothing back. He didn't trust his voice entirely in that moment. Because what he felt was not pride. What he felt was something quieter and stranger and more durable than pride. He felt competent. Not superior. Not exceptional. Not destined for greatness. Competent. Present in the actual sky, doing the actual job with what was actually available. It was the first time in his career that competence had felt like enough. The final debrief of the Aviano exercise ran 2 hours. Sophia ran it. She walked through every flight of the 3-day exercise with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything, and by the time she reached the final day's events, the room was very quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of the first day, but the focused silence of people who were learning something and knew it. When she finished, Colonel Hartley stood up and thanked the multinational crews, ran through the administrative details of the exercise closeout, and dismissed the room. Most people left. Ethan stayed. I wasn't sure why. He hadn't planned to. But as the room emptied, he found that he didn't particularly want to move, and so he sat there while the chairs around him emptied, and the projector clicked off, and the room settled into the particular quiet of a space that has been full of something important, and is now simply itself again. Sophia was gathering her materials from the front table. "Major," he said. She looked up. "I owe you an apology." She waited. 3 days ago in the hangar, what I said about your cockpit." He stopped, restarted. "I said it to get a reaction, to establish something in front of the squadron, to make sure everyone knew that I wasn't intimidated." He paused. It was arrogance, and it was cowardice at the same time, which I didn't understand until now. Sophia set her materials down. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, measured, careful, neither warm nor cold. "What makes you say it was cowardice?" she asked. "Because I didn't do it because I believed it. I did it because I was afraid of what I'd find if I took you seriously. If someone like you could be as good as they said, it meant I wasn't as close to the top as I thought." He met her eyes. "And I'm not ready to not be close to the top. So it was easier to dismiss the standard than to measure myself against it honestly." The room was very quiet. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That is the most honest thing you have said to me since you arrived." "It's the most honest thing I've said to myself." She picked her materials back up. "The apology is accepted, Lieutenant. Don't make me accept another one." She walked to the door. At the threshold, without turning around, she said, "Be at the flight line at 05:30 tomorrow. We have an early launch. The exercise is over." "Yes," she said. "This is something else." She left. He sat in the empty debrief room and felt the 3 days rearranging themselves inside him into something new. The something else turned out to be a solo flight. Not a formation. Not a training event with an evaluator and a graded profile and a standardized debrief card. A single aircraft, a designated working area, a duration, and a single instruction from Sophia, delivered at 0535 on the flight line in the cold pre-dawn. "Fly without the data link," she said. "The whole flight. I'll monitor from here. If you have a genuine emergency, call it. Otherwise, don't call anything." "What's the objective?" he asked. "You'll know when you land." He thought about pushing back. The professional reflex was strong. He wanted parameters, criteria, and a valuable standard. He wanted to know what success looked like so he could build a plan to achieve it. Instead, he climbed in, strapped down, and covered the data link display with his kneeboard. He launched into a sky that was still half dark. For the first 20 minutes, it was genuinely uncomfortable, not dangerous. The aircraft was performing normally, his navigation was reliable, the working area was clear. But the absence of the data link picture produced a low-grade anxiety that he hadn't expected, a continuous background hum of wrongness that he couldn't rationalize away. He was accustomed to seeing himself in the picture. Without the data link, he couldn't see himself. I knew where he was. He knew his altitude, his heading, his fuel, his airspeed. He had everything he needed to fly safely and effectively. But he couldn't see himself in the picture. And that, he realized slowly, was the problem. He had confused seeing himself in the picture with knowing where he was. They were not the same thing. He knew where he was. The picture was simply a representation of that knowledge, a useful tool, a force multiplier, a significant tactical advantage. But it was a picture of reality, not reality itself. And he had been flying the picture instead of the sky for so long that he had forgotten there was a difference. At minute 23, he began to relax. Not because anything changed, because he stopped waiting for something to change. He flew for an hour and 40 minutes. At some point, he couldn't identify exactly when the anxiety went away and was replaced by something he recognized from a long time ago. From his very first solo flight at 19 years old, in a two-seat trainer over the Texas plains, before any of the advanced systems, before any of the tactical training, before any of the scores and rankings and evaluations that had organized his career into a continuous competition for position at the top. He recognized the feeling of simply flying, just the aircraft and the sky and the decisions that the moment required. Nothing more. When he landed and climbed down, Sophia was standing at the edge of the flight line. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at his face with that listening quality she had, reading something underneath the surface, confirming something she had already estimated. "Well," she said. He thought about how to answer. "I've been flying against the picture for 2 years," he said. "I thought I was flying against the sky." She nodded once. "What do I do with that?" "You already did it," she said. "You just flew for an hour and 40 minutes against the sky." She paused. "Do it again tomorrow, and the day after, until the picture is what it's supposed to be, a tool, not a substitute for judgment." She turned to go. "Major," he said, "why are you spending time on this, on me specifically?" She stopped. When she turned back, there was something in her expression that was less guarded than usual. Not open exactly, but honest in a way that felt deliberate, like a door, not all the way open, but no longer locked. "Because you have the ability," she said. "And ability without judgment is a liability. To you and to the people flying beside you." She paused. "I've flown beside pilots who were technically exceptional and professionally dangerous at the same time. You were that pilot 3 days ago. You are starting to become something different." He didn't know what to say to that. "Get some rest," she said. "We have a real mission next week." He stood on the flight line as she walked away and thought, a real mission. He wasn't sure what that meant. But the way she said it flat, serious without any of the theatrical weight that the phrase usually carried when people said it in briefing rooms to make training feel consequential, told him it was exactly what it sounded like. Not an exercise, not a simulation, not a graded evaluation, something real. 3 days later, Ethan was in the intelligence section when he found out what real meant. He had been called in by the squadron's intelligence officer, Captain Mira Johansson, a compact, serious Swede who communicated primarily in data and had the particular manner of someone who had spent so many years dealing in classified information that she had lost the instinct to frame bad news gently. She pointed to a seat. He sat. She opened a file on her secure terminal and turned the screen toward him. 2 days ago, she said, a coalition reconnaissance mission in the eastern Mediterranean detected increased electronic warfare activity, consistent with a system we've been tracking for approximately 14 months. A mobile jamming platform designation, unknown operating profile, highly irregular. Ethan looked at the data. NATO assessment is that the platform is being relocated. We have a short window, possibly 48 to 72 hours, in which it will be in a position where a specific flight profile can establish definitive technical identification of the system. After that, the window closes, possibly permanently. He looked up. What kind of flight profile? Low observable minimal electronic emission extended range complex airspace environment. She paused. The kind of flight profile that doesn't rely heavily on data links or active radar. The sentence landed with the weight of everything Sophia had been teaching him for a week. Who's leading it? He asked, though he already knew. Major Reyes, Johansson said. She requested a second aircraft. She nominated you. The room was very quiet. She nominated me, he repeated. I was surprised too, Johansson said, with the blunt honesty that was her primary personality characteristic. For what it's worth. Ethan looked back at the screen. The mission profile was complex, not impossible, but complex in ways that the exercise had not been real. Environment, real consequences, real electronic warfare threat from a system that NATO had been trying to fully characterize for over a year. And Sophia had asked for him. Specifically, not Wills, who had 2 years of experience with her. Not Brzezinski, who had flown in environments like this before. Not anyone from the established roster of qualified wingmen who had worked with her across multiple deployments. Him. The arrogant rookie who had laughed at her cockpit 8 days ago. He sat with that for a long time after Johansson dismissed him. He tried to understand what it meant. He could think of 2 possibilities. The first was that Sophia believed he was ready, that the week of training had produced something she assessed as sufficient for the mission requirement. The second possibility was darker and more interesting. The second possibility was that the mission required exactly the thing he was learning to do: fly without the picture, navigate without confirmation, make decisions in the presence of corrupted or absent data, and that Sophia had been building him toward this specific requirement all along. Not as a general philosophy of better airmanship, as preparation for a specific thing that she knew was coming. He sat in the hallway outside the intelligence section and turned this over for a long time, and then he stood up and went to find her. She was in the operations center, reviewing the mission parameters with Johansson and a NATO electronic warfare specialist whose name he didn't know yet. She saw him come in. She didn't stop the conversation, but she acknowledged his presence with the briefest shift of her attention, enough to tell him she knew he was there and that he could wait. He waited. When the others left, he walked over. "You knew about this mission when we started flying together," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You were training me for it specifically. I was training you for what pilots need. This mission happens to require what pilots need." She paused. "Those aren't the same thing. But you chose me because you knew the requirement and assessed that I could meet it." "I chose you because you asked me the right question," she said. "About the cockpit." He frowned. "I asked it to embarrass you." "I know why you asked it. The question was still the right one." She looked at him steadily. A pilot who wants to know why the cockpit is empty is a pilot who is still capable of understanding the answer. Most pilots don't ask. They look at the cockpit, see what they expect to see, and move on. She paused. You looked at what wasn't there. That's different. He was quiet. That's why I'm here, she said. Not for the pilots who already understand. For the ones who are still capable of asking. He stood in the operations center and felt something. He hadn't felt in years, not since his first squadron, not since before the scores and rankings had turned flying into a competition he was always winning. He felt small, not diminished, not ashamed. Small in the way that standing in front of something genuinely large makes you small. The honest, clarifying smallness of accurate proportion. He was very good. She was something else. And she was asking him to come with her anyway. When do we brief? He said. 0400 the day after tomorrow. She turned back to the operations table. You should sleep. I'm not going to sleep. I know, she said. Do it anyway. He almost smiled. One question, he said. She looked up. When you flew Operation Silent Horizon, the mission, everyone knows the name of, but nobody knows the details of. Were you afraid the whole time? Or just at the beginning? The question hung in the air between them. Sophia set her pen down. She looked at him with an expression that was more unguarded than anything he had seen from her in 8 days. The whole time, she said quietly. Every single minute of 58 minutes. He absorbed that. And you flew it anyway. I flew it instead, she said. Fear is not the opposite of performance. It is part of it. The question is not how to stop being afraid. The question is what you do with the fear while you are doing the job. She picked the pen back up. He walked out of the operations center into the cold night air of the Aviano flight line and stood there for a moment, looking up at a sky that was clear and deep and full of stars that didn't care at all what happened to the small, excellent, still-learning pilot standing beneath them. He thought about what she had said. Fear is not the opposite of performance. It is part of it. He thought about 58 minutes in a hostile sky with no radar, no communication, no navigation, and the lives of the people flying beside you, depending entirely on the quality of your judgment, in the absence of any tool that could confirm whether your judgment was correct. He thought about what it would have cost to do that. Not the skill, not the training, not the experience. What it would have cost in the interior of the person doing it. The sustained, disciplined, high-wire act of continuing to function with precision in the presence of profound uncertainty and genuine fear, and the knowledge that stopping even for a moment was not an option. He thought about that for a long time, and then he went to his bunk, lay down in the dark, and for the first time in 8 days, did not think about the mission or the training or Sophia Reyes or what the next day would require. He was simply tired, and being tired simply without anything else attached to it felt like a kind of progress. He slept 4 hours, not because the mission let him, because exhaustion finally made the decision his discipline couldn't. When the alarm pulled him back at 03:30, he was already sitting up before it finished its first cycle, that particular soldier's reflex of waking into immediate awareness. Body already calculating time and task before the conscious mind had fully arrived. He dressed in the dark. He didn't review his notes. He had reviewed them so many times over the previous 36 hours that the mission parameters had moved from paper into the interior of him. Altitude blocks, communication, contingencies, the electronic profile of the target system, the geometry of the approach, the egress options ranked in order of survivability. It was all there. Not memorized in the way he had memorized academy material, recallable on demand, accessible under pressure, but installed. Part of the furniture of his thinking. Sophia had taught him that distinction. There's a difference, she had said during the 0400 brief the previous morning, between knowing something and having it. Knowing is retrieval. Having is availability. When the situation is calm, retrieval is sufficient. When everything is wrong, you can only use what you have. He had written that down. Then he had spent 2 hours reading it until he didn't need to read it anymore. The operations center was lit and purposeful when he arrived at 0345. Captain Johansson was at her terminal. The NATO electronic warfare specialist. He had learned his name by then, Major Henrik Voss, a German with enormous hands and the precise, unhurried manner of someone whose entire professional life had been spent listening to things other people couldn't hear, was running a final check on the technical collection parameters. And Sophia was at the mission table, standing not sitting, reviewing the final weather update with her grease pencil, moving in those small deliberate marks that Ethan had come to understand were not notes in any conventional sense. They were decisions. Each mark was a commitment. A variable assessed a contingency, selected a choice made and closed, so it didn't have to be remade in the air. She looked up when he came in. "Weather moved," she said immediately. No preamble, no good morning. Cloud base dropped 200 feet in the primary approach corridor. We're adjusting the entry altitude and compressing the initial timing by 4 minutes. He walked to the table. She showed him the change. He looked at it for 30 seconds. "The compressed timing puts us through the transition point at a different phase of their patrol cycle," he said. "Yes." "Which is better or worse?" "Better. The adjusted timing puts us through the highest risk segment during the 12-minute window, when their radar pattern typically resets. We lose 4 minutes of collection time on the back end, but we gain a cleaner approach." She paused. "The risk equation favors the adjustment." He looked at her. "You already decided this before I walked in." "Yes." "Then why are you showing me—" She set the pencil down and looked at him directly. "Because you're flying the left seat of this mission, and you need to understand every decision I've made and why I've made it. Not so you can approve them. So that if something happens to me in the next 4 hours, you can continue the mission with full situational awareness of the reasoning behind the plan." She paused. "A wingman who only knows the plan is a wingman who stops when the plan stops. I need a wingman who knows the thinking." The distinction landed in his chest with a weight he hadn't expected. She wasn't briefing him. She was handing him something. The interior architecture of a decision, not just its surface. He looked at the chart again differently this time. "Walk me through the rest of it," he said. "Everything. The reasoning, not just the parameters." For the next 40 minutes, that's exactly what she did. They launched in the dark. No formation lights beyond the minimum required for airspace deconfliction. Radar in standby. Data link off deliberately, not as a training exercise this time, but because the mission requirement was to emit nothing that could provide an adversary a trackable signature. Ethan flew on Sophia's wing by watching her aircraft through the heads-up display and through his own instincts, and for the first 10 minutes, the absence of the data link produced the same background anxiety it had produced during his solo training flight. The same low hum of wrongness. The same instinctive reaching for confirmation that wasn't there. He recognized it this time. He acknowledged it the way Sophia had taught him, not suppressing it, not arguing with it, just noting its presence and returning attention to the job. The anxiety didn't disappear, but it stopped running anything. They flew east. The mission profile required a specific geographic approach corridor that kept them below the radar coverage of 3 separate tracking systems, while maintaining adequate distance from the airspace boundaries of 2 nations, whose cooperation was politically unavailable for this particular operation. Sophia had planned the route herself over 3 days, and Ethan had reviewed it until he understood not just what it was, but why every segment was where it was. In the air, it felt different from the chart. Every waypoint arrived with the specific texture of the actual sky altitude variations, from the briefed standard minor heading corrections, from the actual winds, the way the timing adjusted continuously in response to real conditions, while the overall shape of the plan held. He followed. He watched. He learned. At minute 31, Sophia made a heading change that was not in the briefed plan. No radio call. No explanation. She simply turned 12 degrees right, held the new heading for 40 seconds, then returned to the original track. Ethan followed the turn without question. He spent the following 60 seconds trying to understand what she had seen. Then he saw it. Or rather, he heard it, a faint electronic emission on a frequency he'd been monitoring passively, so brief and faint that it barely registered the kind of signal that sophisticated jamming systems produced intermittently as a byproduct of their own operation. Not a transmission, not an intentional emission. A bleed. The radio frequency equivalent of a man behind a closed door accidentally coughing. She had heard it. She had moved them away from it before he had consciously registered it. He hadn't been slow. The signal had lasted less than 2 seconds. She had been faster. He made a note of it in the part of his mind that was running continuously in the background, collecting data. Not about the mission, but about her, how she thought, how she sensed, how she processed an environment in real time, with an efficiency that looked from the outside like something close to intuition. But was. He was increasingly certain something much more disciplined than that. It was not intuition. It was pattern recognition at a speed that made it look like intuition. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. At minute 52, they reached the initial point. The moment that designated the beginning of the actual collection run. Everything before this had been maneuvering. Everything from this point forward was the mission itself, a specific flight path at a specific altitude, and airspeed maintained with a precision that would determine whether the technical collection equipment recorded data of sufficient quality to definitively characterize the target system. Sophia steadied the aircraft. Ethan steadied beside her. The collection run was scheduled for 14 minutes. At minute 3 of the collection run, the first problem appeared. Not catastrophic, not immediately dangerous, but wrong. The target system's emission pattern, which should have been consistent with the 14 months of prior observation data that had defined the mission parameters, shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that screamed warning. In a way that was subtle enough that a pilot focused on flying the collection geometry might not notice it at all. Ethan noticed it. He noticed it because for the previous 36 hours, he had spent time with Major Voss, reviewing the target system's technical signature. Not the tactical parameters, not the collection geometry, but the actual electromagnetic signature of the system itself, until he could recognize it the way a person recognizes a familiar voice, even when it's saying something new. The voice was different, not absent, not replaced, different. He made no radio call. The mission was emissions quiet. He checked his monitoring equipment again. Still different. He ran through the possibilities as quickly as he could. Equipment malfunction on his side possible, and the first thing to rule out. He ran a quick self-check. The equipment was functioning normally. The difference was not in his system. It was in the target, which meant one of 3 things. The target system had been modified since the last observation data. The target system had been replaced with a different system. Or the target system knew they were there and had changed its emission profile deliberately. None of those 3 possibilities was good. The third one was acutely bad. He had no way to communicate this to Sophia without breaking emission silence. He had 11 minutes left in the collection run. He flew. At minute 6. Sophia made a small adjustment. She compressed the collection geometry very slightly, shortening the run by approximately 90 seconds in a way that could have been a response to a navigation correction or a wind update or any number of routine in-flight adjustments. But Ethan recognized it. She had seen it too. She was adjusting the geometry to optimize collection of the modified signature, while simultaneously beginning the process of repositioning for an earlier-than-planned egress. She had assessed all 3 possibilities and was already acting on the most conservative interpretation. He adjusted with her. No radio call, no confirmation. He had understood what she was doing and why, and he moved because the situation required it, and the coordination happened, not through communication, but through shared understanding of a complex tactical situation by 2 people who had spent enough time thinking together that the thinking had begun to align. It was, he realized distantly, the most sophisticated thing he had ever done in an aircraft. And it was happening without a single word. At minute 9, the situation stopped being subtle. The emission profile shifted again, this time dramatically. the signal strength jumping by a factor that put it in a completely different category of activity. Not a passive system in operation, an active system in engagement mode. They had been detected, not necessarily tracked, not necessarily targeted. But the platform had transitioned from passive operation to active search, which meant the window between detection and tracking was measured in seconds, not minutes. Sophia was already moving. Not in the direction of the briefed egress route. Away from it. Ethan had 2 seconds to understand why and commit or follow blindly and hope. He spent 1.5 of those seconds understanding. The briefed egress route ran through a corridor that was no longer safe. The target system's newly revealed emission profile put its coverage range significantly beyond the original NATO estimate, which meant the planned egress corridor was inside the threat envelope. The corridor they should have been safe in was already compromised. Sophia had seen this in real time, reassessed the entire geometric picture, and chosen an egress vector that added 12 minutes to their flight time, but kept them outside the threat envelope as it was actually configured, not as it had been estimated to be configured. He committed. He followed. For 3 minutes, neither of them spoke. They flew with the particular kind of intensity that has no drama in it. No soundtrack, no heightened awareness, no cinematic clarity. Just continuous, precise decision-making at high speed in a rapidly evolving environment with incomplete information and no margin for the kind of errors that the comfortable world of training exercises absorbs without consequence. Real consequence. Real stakes. This was what she had been talking about. Not the philosophy of it, not the abstract principle. This specific thing happening right now in the actual sky. At minute 12, they cleared the threat envelope boundary. Sophia came over the radio for the first time since the initial point. "You saw the signature change at minute 3, she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What did you assess?" 3 possibilities. Modification, replacement, or active response to our presence. I couldn't rule out the third. Neither could I. A pause. "What would you have done if I hadn't been there?" He thought about it honestly. "I would have called it," he said. Broken emissions silence reported the anomaly, continued the collection run pending guidance. "And the egress?" "I would have taken the briefed route." Another pause. "That would have put you inside the threat envelope," she said. Based on the actual emission profile, the briefed egress corridor has approximately an 80% probability of detection and a 40% probability of engagement. The number sat in the air between them. 40%. He absorbed that. "How did you calculate the new egress geometry that fast?" he asked. "I didn't calculate it," she said. "I already knew it." "You planned an alternate egress." "I planned 3 alternate egresses, based on 3 possible threat configurations that fell outside the NATO estimate range." She paused. "The intelligence estimate was good, but intelligence estimates have uncertainty ranges. I planned for the uncertainty." He flew in silence for a moment. "You planned for a scenario where the intelligence was wrong before you ever got in the aircraft," he said. "I always plan for a scenario where the intelligence is wrong," she said. "Not because intelligence is bad, because the world is more complicated than any estimate can fully capture." He thought about that for the rest of the egress. I thought about what it meant to carry 3 alternate solutions to a problem that, according to all available information, didn't exist yet. To hold that weight quietly, without drama, without even mentioning it in the brief, because mentioning it would raise questions and require explanations and consume time and attention that were needed elsewhere, and because a pilot who had done her preparation correctly didn't need to announce it. She simply had it. Available, not just known. They landed back at Aviano with 20 minutes of fuel remaining tighter than any training profile would have permitted, the direct result of the extended alternate egress route. Sophia taxied to the hardstand without any visible sign of the previous 3 hours. Ethan climbed down from his aircraft and stood on the flight line and noticed that his hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the sustained, concentrated effort of managing a genuine high-stakes environment for 3 hours at the absolute edge of his capability. He had not been frightened during the mission itself. There hadn't been room for it. The task density had been too high. The shaking arrived afterward as the sustained tension began to release the body's honest accounting of what the previous 3 hours had actually cost. He stood there and let it pass. Sophia walked past him toward the debrief room and paused. She looked at his hands. She didn't say anything about them. "Good mission," she said. "We didn't complete the collection run," he said. "We collected 8 minutes of data on a significantly modified threat profile that NATO's entire assessment architecture didn't know existed." She looked at him steadily. "That is a better intelligence outcome than the one we were sent to achieve. And we came home." She paused. "That is a successful mission, Lieutenant." He looked at her. "You didn't tell me about the alternate egress plans," he said. "In the brief, you didn't mention them." "No." "Why?" She considered the question for a moment. "Because if I tell every wingman about every contingency I carry, 2 things happen," she said. "They spend mental energy tracking my contingencies instead of building their own. And they start to use my preparation as a substitute for their own." She paused. "I needed you thinking about the mission, not about my safety net." "But in the air I used them, and you followed. Because you understood the situation well enough to recognize the right move when it happened, even without knowing in advance that it was coming." She tilted her head very slightly. "That is not a small thing." He stood with that. "You trusted me to be able to do that," he said. "Before I knew I could." "Yes," she said simply. She walked toward the debrief room. He followed. Inside, Major Voss was already reviewing the collected data on his terminal and the expression on his face, a German electronic warfare specialist who communicated primarily in measured technical language and had, in Ethan's observation, never appeared surprised by anything, was something Ethan hadn't seen there before. He looked genuinely startled. "Major Reyes," Voss said without preamble, without looking up from his terminal. "The emission profile we collected this is not a modification of the system we were tracking." Sophia stopped. "No," she said. "This is a different system entirely." He looked up. "This is a generation beyond the platform in the NATO estimate. The tracking parameters, the frequency agility range, the power output. This is not an upgrade. This is a successor platform." He looked back at the screen. "This changes the entire threat assessment for the Eastern Mediterranean operating environment." The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at Sophia. She was already looking at the data. Her expression hadn't changed dramatically. She was too disciplined for that, but something in her posture had shifted. A specific kind of stillness that he was learning to read as her most intense form of attention. "How long has it been operational?" she asked Voss. "Based on what we collected, and we're going to need the full analysis team on this, but based on the initial signatures, possibly 6 to 8 months. 6 to 8 months, she said. The number meant something specific. 6 to 8 months was long enough that NATO's current tactical planning for Eastern Mediterranean operations was built around a threat picture that was already obsolete. Every exercise, every escalation scenario, every contingency plan that incorporated an assessment of that system's capabilities was potentially compromised. "We need to get this to Brussels tonight," Sophia said. "Already composing the flash message," Johansson said from the doorway, where she had appeared without Ethan noticing her terminal already open. Sophia nodded once. She turned to Ethan. "Do you understand now why the mission parameters mattered?" she said. "The specific altitude blocks the timing the emissions discipline. If we had used active radar, if we had used the data link, if we had operated with a standard electronic profile, the platform would have known we were there before we were in collection range. We would have collected nothing. Or worse, it would have moved. We would have confirmed its existence without characterizing it," he said. "And NATO would have spent the next year looking for a system that no longer existed in the location they were looking." She paused. "The discipline was the mission, not the collection geometry, the discipline." He understood, not just intellectually, in the way that understanding lands when it has been earned rather than received. "Go write your debrief notes," she said. "I need everything you observed on the signature change timestamps, frequencies, power estimates, sequence. Everything." He went. He wrote for 90 minutes. When he came back, the operations center had transformed. The flash message had gone. Responses were coming in from Brussels and from the NATO Maritime Command, and from at least 2 national intelligence agencies whose designators he recognized but wasn't cleared to discuss outside a secure space. The mission had quietly and without fanfare become something significant. Not the mission as planned. The mission, as it had actually unfolded, improvised in real time against a threat that was more sophisticated than anticipated, in an environment more complex than the intelligence had suggested by 2 pilots who had communicated not in words but in shared understanding while maintaining the precise emissions discipline that had made the collection possible. Hartley found Ethan in the hallway at 0900. He didn't say much. He put his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, squeezed once and said, "Good work out there." Then he walked into the operations center. Ethan stood in the hallway and felt the weight of the previous settling into him. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter. The specific gravity of a thing that had actually mattered, handled as well as it could have been handled, completed. He found Sophia later in the flight planning room alone, the paper chart spread across the table again. "What are you planning now?" he asked. "Nothing yet," she said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She looked up. "About the fact that the system we found has been operational for 6 to 8 months, which means there are other things we haven't found yet." She looked back at the chart. "There are always other things we haven't found yet." He sat down across from her. "That doesn't bother you?" he asked. "Not knowing." "It drives me," she said. "Not knowing is not the enemy. Believing you know when you don't, that is the enemy." She made a small mark on the chart. A pilot who is comfortable not knowing is a pilot who keeps looking. A pilot who believes he already knows stops looking. She paused. The moment you stop looking is the moment the thing you missed becomes lethal. He sat with that for a moment. "The rookies who come through here," he said slowly. "The ones like me when I arrived. How many of them have you seen actually change?" Sophia was quiet for a long moment. "Not as many as I'd like," she said honestly. "Most people's character is already set by the time they get to a squadron like this. The arrogance is protective. It's not actually about confidence. It's about fear. Fear of not being as good as they need to be. And fear that armored in arrogance is very difficult to reach." She looked at him. "You were afraid too." "I know. The difference is that underneath your arrogance, there was still a question. Most people who are genuinely closed don't ask questions. Even when they look like they're asking, they're actually making statements." She paused. "You came to my office and asked about my cockpit. Not to impress me. Not to challenge me again. Because you genuinely wanted to understand what you'd missed." She turned back to the chart. "That question is why you're sitting here instead of someone else." He looked at her. There was something he had wanted to ask since the previous night, since she had told him about the fear she carried through 58 minutes of the most difficult flying of her career. He had held the question because it felt like too much, too personal, too presumptuous for the careful distance she maintained between herself and the people around her. But they had just spent 3 hours in the air together, in an environment where that distance had temporarily dissolved, and he felt the question rising again, and this time he didn't hold it back. "Silent horizon," he said. "When you came out of it, when you got your wingman home and the communications came back and you were safe, what did you feel?" Sophia didn't answer immediately. She set the pencil down. She looked at a space somewhere between the chart and the far wall, and her expression did something he hadn't seen it do before. Not open. She was not a woman who opened easily or often, or probably at all in most contexts, but honest in a way that felt like it cost something. "I sat in the cockpit for 11 minutes after shutdown," she said. "The ground crew was standing around the aircraft. My wingman was already out. Everyone was waiting." She paused. "I couldn't move. Not because I was hurt. Not because of shock. Because for 58 minutes, I had been holding everything. Every calculation, every decision, every alternative, every contingency in my hands simultaneously, without putting any of it down, without letting any of it slip, because letting any of it slip would have cost lives." She stopped. "And when it was over, when it was actually over, and I didn't have to hold it anymore, I didn't know how to let go. I was very still. It took 11 minutes, she said, to remember how to just be a person again, after being only a pilot for almost an hour. He absorbed that. How do you carry that? He asked quietly. The weight of it, all of it. She looked at him. You don't carry it, she said. You do the job. You come home. You sleep. You get up the next morning and you plan the next mission. She picked the pencil back up. The weight is not something you manage. It is something you accept. The moment you start trying to manage it is the moment it starts managing you. He sat across from her in the quiet flight planning room as the rest of the base moved through its morning around them, and he thought about what it meant to spend a career doing this. Not the flying. The flying was the part everyone understood, the part that looked like the job from the outside. But the interior part. The part that no patch or score or reputation could capture. The disciplined, continuous, unglamorous work of staying clear, keeping the fear from making decisions, keeping the arrogance from closing questions, keeping the door open to what you didn't yet know, so that when the moment arrived, which it always arrived, you were still capable of doing the job the moment actually required. I was 27 years old. He understood now with a clarity that was both humbling and energizing at the very beginning of understanding what this meant. Sophia made another mark on the chart. He watched her hand move, and he thought, I want to fly with her again. Not because she would protect him, not because her preparation would compensate for his gaps, because flying with her was teaching him what flying actually was, and he was not close to finished learning. The intelligence from the mission hit Brussels like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were immediate. Within 48 hours of Johansson's flash message, Aviano received 3 separate secure communications, one from NATO's Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe 1 from the U.S. European Command, and one from an office designation that Ethan recognized from his security briefings as belonging to a NATO intelligence fusion cell that technically didn't exist in any unclassified document. All 3 wanted the same thing. They wanted Sophia. Not a written report. Not a debrief summary. Not a technical analysis from Major Voss, whose preliminary findings had already been transmitted in full. They wanted the pilot who had flown the mission, who had recognized the signature anomaly in real time, who had adapted the collection geometry on the fly, and executed an unplanned egress against a threat profile nobody had expected to encounter. They wanted to understand how she had known. Colonel Hartley called her into his office at 0800 on the second day after the mission and delivered this information with the particular expression of a man who is announcing good news to someone he suspects won't receive it as good news. He was correct. Sophia stood in front of his desk and listened without changing her expression. When he finished, she said, "Who flies the follow-on mission?" Hartley blinked. "I'm sorry. The target system has moved since we collected. It will move again within 72 hours based on its observed relocation pattern. If NATO wants a second collection opportunity against the new platform configuration, the window is closing." She looked at him steadily. "Who flies the follow-on while I'm in Brussels explaining the first mission?" Hartley was quiet for a moment. "There is no follow-on tasked yet," he said carefully. "There should be. Sophia." He used her first name, which he did rarely. "This is a significant recognition. Requesting a direct debrief. Do you understand what that means for this squadron? For your career?" "I understand what the target system means for every pilot operating in the Eastern Mediterranean for the next 10 years, she said. "I'd like to make sure someone is still looking at it while I'm sitting in a conference room in Belgium." Hartley looked at her for a long moment. "Cole," he said, "what about him? You're going to recommend him for the follow-on, aren't you?" Sophia paused. "He's ready. He's been here 3 weeks. He flew the first mission. He understood the signature anomaly independently. He executed an unplanned egress geometry without a radio call because he read the situation accurately and moved correctly." She paused. "He is ready for the follow-on, not as lead, as the primary collection platform with Wills on his wing." Hartley leaned back. He studied her with the expression he used when he was thinking through several things simultaneously and didn't want to be rushed. "You trust him," he said. I trust his judgment in the specific environment the mission requires, she said. That is the only kind of trust that matters operationally. Those aren't the same thing. No, she agreed. They aren't. Hartley was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I'll put the follow-on request to shape. I'll nominate Cole and Wills for the crew. He paused. And you'll be on a plane to Brussels in 6 hours. She nodded once and turned toward the door. Sophia, he said. She stopped. You could have taken credit for the whole thing. The mission, the discovery, the egress. Every bit of it was yours. You planned it, you flew it, you recognized what was in front of you when everyone else was looking at the wrong map. He paused. Instead, you're standing in my office trying to hand the follow-on to a pilot who 3 weeks ago laughed at your cockpit. She turned back just enough to look at him. The discovery doesn't belong to me, she said. The sky produced it. I was just paying attention. She paused. Cole is learning to pay attention. That's worth more than any report I give in Brussels. She left. Hartley sat in his office for a long time after she was gone. Then he picked up his phone and started making calls. Ethan found out from Wills. She appeared at the door of the flight planning room where he had been working through the technical analysis of the collected data with Voss, something he had started doing voluntarily without assignment, because understanding what they had found felt inseparable from understanding what the mission had actually been. We have orders, Wills said. He looked up. Follow-on collection mission. Your primary. I'm your wing. She stepped into the room and dropped a folder on the table. Sophia recommended you. Hartley approved it. Shape signed off 20 minutes ago. He looked at the folder. He looked at Wills. She's going to Brussels, he said. Leaves in 4 hours. He absorbed that. Sophia would not be there. No senior pilot running the geometry. No experienced hand recognizing the anomalies he might miss. No second set of eyes built from decades of precisely this kind of operation. Just him and Wills against a target system that had already demonstrated it was more sophisticated than NATO's best assessment in an environment that had already proven it could go wrong in ways the briefing hadn't anticipated. Are you worried? Wills asked. She wasn't being provocative. It was a direct question from a pilot who needed to understand her mission partner's actual state. He thought about it honestly. Yes, he said. She nodded. Good. He looked at her. Pilots who aren't worried about this kind of mission are the ones who haven't thought about it carefully enough, she said. The worry is information. It tells you where your preparation needs work. She pulled out a chair and sat down. So let's find out where your preparation needs work. They spent 4 hours at that table. Voss stayed. Johansson stayed. They pulled every piece of intelligence on the target system's new configuration. Every fragment of data from the first collection run. Every scrap of movement pattern analysis that the fusion cell in Brussels had transmitted back in the 12 hours since receiving Johansson's flash message. The picture was better than before the first mission. It was also more alarming. The system's emission profile. The one Ethan had noticed shifting at minute 3 of the collection run had been reanalyzed with the full Brussels team on it, and the updated assessment was stark. The platform's operational range was 30% greater than the previous estimate. Its frequency agility, the speed at which it could shift between operating bands, was faster than any fielded system in NATO's current threat database. And there was a new piece of data from the movement pattern analysis that Voss had flagged with the particular quiet alarm of a man who preferred understatement. The system appeared to be learning, not in any dramatic artificial intelligence sense, but its patrol patterns over the past 6 months showed a gradual, consistent evolution. Small adjustments to timing, to position, to emission intervals that were consistent with an operator who was studying the observable patterns of NATO collection attempts and adapting to make collection more difficult. It was being used by people who understood what they were doing, and they were getting better at it. Ethan sat with that information for a long time. The window Sophia identified, he said finally. The 72 hours before it relocates again. Is that still the assessment? Johansson checked her terminal. Updated estimate from Brussels is 60 hours. They revised it based on the movement pattern analysis. 60 hours. which meant the follow-on mission needed to launch within the next 36 to have any margin for weather or contingency. "What's the weather doing?" he asked. Johansson pulled the forecast. It was not good. A weather system was moving through the operating area, not severe enough to ground the mission, but complex enough to reduce the available collection window and force the flight profile into a narrower altitude band than the first mission had used. Ethan looked at the chart. He picked up the pencil. He started working. Not the way he had worked 3 weeks ago, from the plan outward, building a structure and fitting the environment into it. The way Sophia had taught him. From the environment inward. From the actual sky, the actual threat, the actual weather, and outward toward a plan that the reality could support. He worked for 2 hours. He built 3 alternate egress routes, each calibrated against a different possible threat configuration based on the range envelope data from the updated assessment. He briefed Wills on all 3. She listened. She asked 6 questions. The questions were good, precise, tactically specific, focused on the edges of the plan where the planning assumptions were most likely to be wrong. He had answers for 4 of them. For 2, he said, "I don't know. Here's how we handle it if that's what we find." Wills looked at him for a moment. "Sophia teach you that," she said. "Teach me what? To say I don't know without it costing you something." He thought about it. "She showed me that not knowing and acting on not knowing were 2 different problems. The first one is just reality. The second one is a choice." Wills nodded slowly. "She's been trying to teach that to pilots for 10 years. She paused. "Most of them can say it. Very few of them actually mean it." "Do I mean it?" "Ask me after the mission," she said. I went to find Sophia before she left for Brussels. She was at her aircraft, not the mission aircraft. Her personal assigned jet, doing a pre-departure walk-around that she didn't need to do. The aircraft had been checked by the ground crew. She was doing it anyway, moving around the aircraft with the methodical attention she brought to everything, not because she doubted the crew chief's work, but because this was what she did before every flight, without exception, without modification for circumstances. He stood at the edge of the hardstand and watched for a moment. Then he walked over. She heard him coming and said, without looking up from the leading-edge inspection she was running her hand along, "The follow-on brief went well. You knew before I said anything. You walk differently when you've been planning seriously." She straightened. "How's the weather look?" "Complicated. We have a 60-hour window, maybe less. Narrow, but workable." She moved to the next inspection point. "How many alternate egress routes did you build?" 3. She paused. "I built 3 for the first mission." "I know." She resumed the inspection. "Wills is a good wingman. She'll read the environment well. Brief her on the signature anomalies from the first run, not the technical details, the behavioral pattern. What the system did when it detected us. That's what she needs to recognize if it happens again." "Already did." She stopped again. This time she looked at him. "Already did," she repeated. 4 hours of mission prep. Voss stayed. Johansson stayed. We went through everything, updated profile movement patterns. Weather 3 alternate egresses." He paused. "I still have 2 questions I can't answer, and I briefed Wills on the contingencies for both." Sophia looked at him steadily. The expression on her face was one he hadn't seen directed at him before. He had seen it directed at the mission data, at weather charts, at tactical problems that interested her. The expression of someone who has found a thing that is genuinely worth their attention. She turned back to the inspection without speaking. He waited. "What are the 2 questions?" she said finally. "Whether the updated range envelope applies uniformly in all directions, or whether there's a directional bias in the coverage pattern that the movement analysis can't resolve from the current dataset. And whether the systems operator has identified our specific collection profile from the first mission and adapted to deny it." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "The first question, there's a directional bias. The emission data from the first run shows slightly reduced power output on the northern aspect. Not enough to be in the original intelligence assessment, but visible in the raw data if you look at the azimuth resolved power curves." She kept her eyes on the inspection. "I flagged it in my notes for Brussels. I should have flagged it in your mission brief. I'll send it to Johansson in the next hour. And the second question. Assume yes, she said. Assume he identified your collection profile and has adjusted for it. Plan accordingly. Which means we can't use the same approach geometry. Which means you can't use any approach geometry he can predict. She finished the inspection, turned to face him fully. What he can predict is what he knows about NATO collection doctrine. Standard approach, altitudes. Standard collection, geometries, standard emission profiles. Those are all published in ways that a sophisticated adversary can reverse engineer. She paused. What he cannot predict is an approach that doesn't follow doctrine. One that's been built around the actual environment rather than the standard template. The way you built the first mission. The way you're going to build the follow-on. She tilted her head very slightly. You've been doing it for 2 hours. You're most of the way there. He looked at her. The northern aspect, he said slowly. The reduced power output. If we approach from the north, you compress the available collection window significantly, maybe 4 minutes instead of 8. But we stay outside the threat envelope the whole time. Yes, 4 minutes might be enough for Voss's equipment to get a full characterization if we optimize the collection altitude and airspeed. It's enough if the geometry is right, she said. Check with Voss on the exact parameters. I was already doing the geometry in his head. This changes the egress as well, he said. The northern approach puts us on the wrong side of the weather system for the planned egress, she finished. You'll need a new primary egress. Your first alternate becomes your primary. He stopped. He looked at her. You already worked all of this out, he said. Yes. Before you decided not to fly the follow-on yourself. She met his eyes. Yes. The silence between them held something significant. You're giving me the solution, he said carefully. But you're not flying it. I'm giving you the reasoning, she corrected. The solution is yours. You still have to execute it in a real sky against a real threat with real consequences. The reasoning is just a starting point. She paused. It is always just a starting point. He stood on the hardstand and felt the weight of what she was doing. She had worked out the second mission, the approach, the geometry, the collection profile, the egress with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. She had the solution. She could fly it herself, and the probability of success would be higher with her in the aircraft than with him. That was simply the truth, and they both knew it. And she was giving it to him anyway, not as a gift, as the next lesson. What if I get it wrong, he said. Define wrong. What if I miss something? Make the wrong call. If the situation goes in a direction I haven't planned for, and I don't read it the way you would. She looked at him with the steady patience of someone who has heard this question before in many forms, from many pilots at many stages of their development. Then you use what you have, she said. You make the best decision available with the information in front of you, and you bring your wingman home. That's the job. That's the entire job. She paused. I can't be there for every mission you fly for the rest of your career. Nobody can be. At some point, every pilot has to fly in a sky where there is no one more experienced watching over them. This is that flight. He absorbed that. You could still lead it, he said. Brussels could wait. Brussels cannot wait. And you can fly this mission. She said it without hesitation, without the softening qualifiers that reassurance usually came wrapped in. A statement of operational assessment. You have the preparation. You have the reasoning. You understand the environment, and you have something that you didn't have 3 weeks ago. What's that? You know what you don't know, she said. That is not a small thing. Most pilots spend their entire careers without learning it. She picked up her helmet bag. Send me the debrief when you're back, she said. You'll be in a conference room in Brussels. I'll read it, she said. Send it. She walked toward the aircraft. He stood on the hardstand and watched her go. And then something happened that he hadn't anticipated. She stopped 10 feet from the ladder and turned back. Not all the way, just enough to look at him over her shoulder. Cole, she said. Major, the cockpit. A pause. You asked me why it was empty, and I told you it wasn't. She looked at him steadily. Do you understand now what's in it? He thought about it. He thought about 58 minutes over the eastern Mediterranean, with no radar, no communications, and 2 lives depending on the quality of one person's preparation and judgment and refusal to let fear make decisions. He thought about 3 alternate egress routes carried silently into an operational mission without announcement or drama available rather than simply known. He thought about what it meant to spend a career looking at the space between what you knew and what the world actually was, and filling that space not with assumption or arrogance or the comfortable fiction of certainty, but with preparation, with questions, with the disciplined, ongoing, unglamorous work of staying ready for a reality that would always be more complicated than any estimate. Everything that matters, he said, and nothing that doesn't. She held his gaze for one moment. Then she turned and climbed the ladder. The follow-on mission launched at 0430 the next morning. Ethan and Wills flew in a sky that was more complicated than any simulation he had ever run. The weather system had compressed the available corridor into a band that required continuous active management of altitude and airspeed while maintaining the emissions discipline the mission demanded. There was no comfortable margin. Every decision produced a downstream consequence that had to be tracked and accounted for continuously without pause. He flew it. He flew the approach from the north, using the directional bias Sophia had identified in the raw emission data, compressing the collection window to 4 minutes and 11 seconds of optimal geometry. 4 minutes and 11 seconds was enough. At minute 2 of the collection, Run the system did exactly what Sophia had warned him it might. It began an active search pattern consistent with a platform that had detected an anomaly in its normal electromagnetic environment. Not a targeting lock, a search. The window between search and track was narrowing. Ethan made the call. Not the planned egress. His first alternate, which was now his primary. He called it clearly, calmly, 1 radio transmission, 4 words. Egress, Alpha, now, follow. Wills moved with him instantly. They cleared the threat envelope with 40 seconds to spare. 40 seconds in the actual sky with a real system actively looking for them. I didn't think about it during the egress. The task density was too high. He processed it afterward on the transit home, in the quiet professional space between the acute intensity of the high-threat environment and the landing where the body and mind slowly released what they had been holding. 40 seconds. He flew home with that number. When they landed, Voss met them on the flight line. He was not a man who moved quickly or showed agitation. He was moving quickly. The 4-minute collection window, he said before Ethan had finished descending the ladder. The geometry, the altitude, the approach azimuth, the data quality is exceptional. Better than the first mission. He paused. We have a complete technical characterization of the new platform. All parameters. Everything Brussels needed. Ethan stood on the flight line. He looked up at a sky that was beginning to lighten at the eastern edge. He thought about 40 seconds. He thought about a cockpit that looked empty and wasn't. He thought about a woman sitting in a conference room in Brussels who had given him the reasoning and trusted him to build the solution and then stepped back and let him carry it. He pulled out his phone. He sent 3 words to the secure message channel Johansson had established for mission communications with the Brussels delegation. Mission complete. Full characterization. 47 seconds later, it was 0612 in Aviano, which made it 0712 in Brussels. His phone showed a read receipt. And then 11 seconds after that, 1 word came back. Good. He stood on the flight line and read that word for a long time. It was not an effusive word. It was not a warm word. It was the word of a person for whom language was precise and whose precision he had learned was itself a form of respect. Good meant you did the job. You made the right calls. You brought your wingman home. You delivered what the mission required. Good meant I trusted you, and the trust was not misplaced. Good meant everything it was possible for one word to mean, from a person who chose every word with the care most people reserved for their most important decisions. He pocketed his phone. He picked up his helmet bag. He walked back toward the squadron with Wills beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, because the quiet after a mission like this was its own kind of language, and they were both fluent in it. Then Wills said very quietly, "You flew well." "You called the emitter shift 2 seconds before I did," he said. "I called it. You'd already moved." He thought about that. The prep work. I knew what to listen for. "Sophia's prep work," Will said. "And mine," he said, not defensively, as a statement of fact. "Both." Wills glanced at him. "Both," she agreed. They walked the rest of the way in silence. And in that silence, something settled into Ethan Cole that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago when he had stood in front of a quiet cockpit and laughed. Not certainty, not arrogance restored under a different name. Something more durable than either of those things. The knowledge that he had been tested, genuinely tested in a real environment with real consequences, and had not failed the people depending on him. That was all. That was everything. He didn't need it to be more. Sophia came back from Brussels on a Thursday. No announcement. No scheduled return time distributed to the squadron. One moment she wasn't there, and then she was standing at the operations desk, reviewing the week's flight schedule, with the same quiet focus she brought to everything, as though she had never left, as though Brussels had been a routine administrative errand, rather than a 3-day series of classified briefings with NATO's senior leadership, that had, according to what Johansson told Ethan in carefully measured language, fundamentally altered the alliance's threat assessment for the entire Eastern Mediterranean operating environment. Ethan was in the briefing room when she walked past the open door. He saw her for only a second before she moved out of his sightline. He felt the shift in the squadron's atmosphere, the way you feel a change in air pressure, not dramatic, not announced, but real. Something that had been slightly off balance for 3 days, quietly settled back into place. He went back to his work. 20 minutes later, she appeared in the doorway. "Debrief," she said. "My office, 10 minutes. He closed his notes and went. Her office was the same as it had always been, spare, purposeful, every surface holding something that had a reason to be there. She was already behind the desk when he arrived. The mission debrief he had sent to Brussels open on her secure terminal, a printed copy beside it with marks in the margins. She had annotated his debrief. Every page. He sat down and looked at the printed copy and felt the same sensation he had felt the first morning in the flight planning room. The sensation of being read by someone who was significantly faster and more precise than anything he had previously been read by. "Walk me through the emitter shift at minute 2, she said. "Not what you did, what you were thinking when you did it." He walked her through it. She asked 7 questions. 4 of them exposed gaps in his reasoning that he hadn't known were there, places where he had made the right decision through a combination of preparation and instinct, without fully understanding the causal chain that produced it. She identified each gap with the same flat precision she used for everything, not as criticism, as information. "If you don't understand why a correct decision was correct," she said, "you can't replicate it under different conditions. You got lucky in the sense that the instinct matched the right answer. Next time the conditions will be different, and the instinct will need to be reasoning." "I know." "Tell me the reasoning now. Reconstruct it." He reconstructed it. It took 15 minutes. By the end of those 15 minutes, he understood what he had done and why, with a clarity that his in-the-moment experience of the mission had not provided. The decision that had felt like instinct was, when examined carefully, a chain of judgments, each one building on preparation. On the mission analysis he and Wills had done, on the directional bias data, Sophia had flagged on the behavioral pattern of the system that Voss had walked him through. It hadn't been instinct. It had been compressed. Reasoning. Reasoning that had happened fast enough to feel like instinct because the preparation had been thorough enough. That, Sophia said when he finished, is what you need to be able to do after every mission. Not just the successful ones. Every one. It takes time. Yes, it takes time, and it takes honesty. The honesty is harder than the time. She looked at him steadily. Most pilots debrief the version of events that is most favorable to their decision-making. They don't do it consciously. But the natural instinct is to construct a narrative that makes the decisions look more deliberate and more correct than they actually were. Because the alternative, admitting that a correct outcome was partially the product of luck or incomplete reasoning, is uncomfortable. And dangerous, he said. And dangerous, she agreed. Because the next mission doesn't care about your narrative. It only cares about the quality of your actual reasoning. She closed the printed debrief. Brussels, he said. She looked at him. What happened there? She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who didn't want to answer. The silence of someone choosing how much of an answer to give. They were surprised, she said finally, by the discovery, by the extent to which the threat assessment had drifted from the actual situation, and by the method. She paused. The collection approach, the northern azimuth, the compressed window, the emissions discipline, they wanted to understand how it was developed. What did you tell them? I told them it was developed through the application of preparation to an environment that was more complex than the briefed parameters. She met his eyes. I told them it was developed by a pilot who had spent 2 weeks learning to fly the sky instead of the picture. The room was quiet. You told them about me, he said. I told them about the method. You are the demonstration of the method. She paused. There's a difference. He looked at her. They're going to change the collection doctrine, she said, for this type of target. The directional bias approach, the compressed window geometry, it's going to become standard procedure for platforms of this class. She said it without pride, without any of the self-congratulatory weight that most people would have attached to a sentence like that. Flat, informational. Voss is leading the technical working group. The methodology goes into the standardization package within 60 days. He absorbed that. Something that had begun as a week of training flights at Aviano, and one improvised collection mission, was going to become written doctrine. It would be briefed to pilots across the alliance. It would change the way NATO flew against a class of threat that had been increasing in sophistication and prevalence for the past decade. Not because of a policy decision, because of 2 pilots who had flown into a complicated sky and paid close enough attention to what was actually there. There's something else, Sophia said. Her tone shifted, barely. But he had been reading her tones for weeks, and the shift was clear. Shape is standing up a new cell, she said. A small one, focused on exactly this type of collection work, low observable emissions, quiet against adaptive threat systems. The kind of work where doctrine alone is insufficient, and judgment in real time is the critical variable. She paused. They've asked me to lead it. He looked at her. Are you going to? He said. I've been asked to decide within 30 days. She looked down at the desk for a moment. It would mean leaving Aviano, leaving the squadron. Would it mean leaving instruction? He asked. The work you do here with pilots like me. She was quiet for a moment. That's part of what I have to decide, she said. I understood then why she was telling him. Not because she needed advice. Sophia Reyes was not a person who needed advice on decisions of this magnitude. But because she was thinking out loud in the only way she ever allowed herself to think out loud, which was by stating the facts clearly to someone she trusted to hear them without embellishment. He was that person now. 3 weeks ago, he had not been that person. The recognition of that shift settled into him quietly without ceremony. This squadron produced the mission, he said carefully. The shape cell is a product of what happens here. If you leave to run the cell, what happens to what happens here? She looked at him. That, she said, is exactly the question. She stood up. The debrief was over. 2 days later, Colonel Hartley called a squadron formation. Not a briefing, not a scheduled event. A formation. Every pilot, every crew chief, every intelligence officer, every operations specialist, standing together in the main hangar, in the particular configuration that meant something of consequence was about to be said. Ethan stood in the second row between Wills and Brzezinski. Hartley walked to the front. Howe was not a man who made speeches. He communicated in the same economy of language that characterized the best military leaders. Every word doing a specific job. Nothing decorative. 2 weeks ago, he said. This squadron flew a collection mission against a target system that NATO had been attempting to fully characterize for 14 months. The mission was planned and led by Major Sophia Reyes. The wingman was Lieutenant Ethan Cole on his 3rd week at this unit. He paused. The mission produced a complete technical characterization of a successor platform that NATO did not know existed. The intelligence output has been assessed by SHAPE as the most significant single-mission collection achievement in the Eastern Mediterranean theater in 7 years. The hangar was very quiet. The follow-on mission flown by Lieutenant Cole and Captain Wills produced a second complete characterization that confirmed and expanded the initial findings. The combined collection data is now the foundation of a fundamental revision to NATO's threat assessment for this operating environment. He paused. The methodology developed and employed in both missions has been formally recommended for inclusion in Alliance collection doctrine. He looked around the room. What happened here was not luck, he said. It was not the product of superior technology or superior resources. It was the product of preparation judgment and the disciplined application of skill in an environment that did not cooperate with the plan. He paused. That is what this squadron does. That is what pilots who know how to fly, not systems, not pictures, but the actual sky, are capable of. He looked directly at Sophia. Major Reyes, front and center. She walked forward. What followed was formal, a citation, a decoration, the words that NATO used to acknowledge contribution at the level the Brussels assessment had confirmed. Ethan watched her stand at attention while Hartley read the citation and felt something complicated moving in his chest. Not jealousy. He had long since moved past the reflexive competitiveness that had characterized his first days at Aviano. Something more like witness. The feeling of watching something true, being acknowledged, which was rarer and more valuable than the acknowledgement itself. When Hartley finished, he said, "Lieutenant Cole, Captain Wills, front and center." They walked forward. The citations were shorter, the decorations were different, but they were there. Ethan stood at attention while Hartley read his citation and thought about a cockpit that looked empty and wasn't. About 40 seconds of margin on a real egress. About one word good received on a flight line at 0612 on a morning when the eastern sky was just beginning to show light. When Hartley finished, he dismissed the formation. People moved. Conversation started. The hangar filled with the noise of a squadron returning to its normal momentum. Ethan stood where he was for a moment. Sophia appeared beside him. "Uncomfortable," she said. "A little," he admitted. "Good," she said. "It should be. It means you understand that the recognition is for the mission, not for you." She paused. The mission was bigger than any of us who flew it. He looked at her. "That's not how most people think about recognition." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She started to move away. "Major," he said. She stopped. "Shape. The cell." He paused. "Have you decided?" She looked at him for a moment. "Not yet," she said. She walked away. He stood in the emptying hangar and thought about what it meant that she hadn't decided. Sophia Reyes did not defer decisions. She gathered the relevant information, assessed it, and acted. He had watched her do it continuously for 3 weeks on weather, on mission parameters, on tactical problems that would have paralyzed most pilots. The hesitation around Brussels was not indecision. It was a different kind of decision, one that cost something. He understood suddenly and clearly what it cost. She had spent a career building something here, not a reputation, not a record, but a practice. The practice of reaching pilots at the specific moment when they were still capable of being reached. Of finding the question underneath the arrogance, the hunger, underneath the performance, the pilot, underneath the ranking. Of taking those pilots and showing them patiently and precisely, and without drama, what the sky actually required. The shape cell would be important. The doctrine work would matter across the alliance for a generation. But it wasn't this, and she knew it. 3 days after the formation, Ethan did something that surprised him. He went to Hartley's office, not to report, not because he had been summoned. He knocked on the door at 1400 on a Tuesday afternoon, and when Hartley said come in, he came in and stood in front of the desk and said, "I'd like to talk about Major Reyes and the shape assignment, sir." Hartley looked at him for a moment. "Sit down, Lieutenant." He sat. "You know about the assignment," Hartley said. "She told me." "She told you." Hartley's expression was unreadable. That's interesting. Sir, she's deciding whether to leave Aviano, whether to leave the instruction work she does here, and I think... He stopped, restarted. I think the Alliance needs both things, the cell and what she does here, and I'm not sure she believes she can do both. Hartley leaned back. What do you propose? He said. I don't know exactly. I'm a lieutenant with 3 weeks in this squadron. I'm not in a position to propose anything to Shape. He paused. But you are. And you know what she does here in a way that the Brussels staff doesn't. They see the mission output. They see the collection data and the doctrine recommendation. They don't see the work that produces the pilots who can fly those missions. Hartley was quiet for a long moment. You came in here, he said slowly, to advocate for a training program on behalf of a major who did not ask you to do this, and almost certainly doesn't know you're doing it. Yes, sir. Based on 3 weeks of experience. Based on what I understand those 3 weeks to have produced, sir. He held Hartley's gaze. I came here not knowing how to fly without the picture. I came here not knowing what I didn't know, which is the more dangerous of the two problems. I'm leaving for a real operational assignment in 6 weeks. And I am significantly less likely to get someone killed because of what happened in this squadron in the past 3 weeks. He paused. That is not an abstract benefit. That is an operational outcome. And it belongs to her. Hartley studied him. Colonel, Ethan said. Whatever the Shape cell does, whatever doctrine it produces, whatever collection it enables, it starts with pilots who can do the work. And pilots who can do the work come through places like this, through instruction like hers. He stopped. I'm not saying Brussels is wrong to want her. I'm saying the pipeline that produces the pilots Brussels needs runs through what she does here, and it would be worth knowing whether there's a structure that preserves both. The office was quiet. Hartley looked at him for a long time. You know, he said finally, when Sophia told me to put you on the follow-on mission, I thought she was taking a significant risk. That it was the kind of confidence that comes from wanting something to be true, rather than assessing that it is. Ethan said nothing. I was wrong, Hartley said. He stood up. I can't promise anything, Lieutenant. Shape makes its own decisions, and they don't typically structure senior assignments around the preferences of squadron commanders. He paused. But I can make a call, and I can make sure the right information is in front of the right people. That's all I'm asking, sir. Hartley nodded once. Dismissed. Ethan walked out of Hartley's office and stood in the hallway and felt the slight dizziness of having done something he hadn't planned to do and couldn't fully evaluate. He had walked into a colonel's office and advocated for a structural arrangement affecting a major's career assignment based on 3 weeks of experience and the conviction that what he had received in those 3 weeks was worth protecting. It was either the most presumptuous thing he had ever done or the most honest. He wasn't certain which. He went back to his work and didn't tell anyone what he had done. A week passed. The squadron flew. The weather changed twice. Voss's technical working group produced a preliminary doctrine paper that circulated to the NATO standardization body with a classification marking Ethan wasn't cleared to discuss outside a secure space. The Eastern Mediterranean Threat Assessment, revised in the light of the mission data, was distributed to every NATO command with forces operating in the region. Ethan flew 4 training missions. He flew them without the data link on 2 of them voluntarily, as self-imposed standard. On the 3rd day of the 2nd week after the formation, Sophia appeared at the door of the flight planning room where he was working. "Walk with me," she said. They walked out to the flight line, which was where she seemed to do her most significant thinking, moving in that unhurried way she moved through everything, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Hartley called Brussels," she said. Ethan kept his face neutral. "Shape came back with a modified proposal," she continued. "The cell is planned, plus a formal instruction program structured resourced attached to the cell's work. Pilots rotating through a standardized curriculum built around the methodology from the missions." She paused. "I would lead both. It would mean leaving Aviano, but it would not mean leaving the instruction work." He looked at her. "Hartley told them what the instruction produces," she said carefully. "He made the argument with some specificity." She looked at him. He told me he wasn't the one who gave him the argument. The flight line was quiet. I stepped out of my lane, Ethan said. Yes, she agreed. Significantly. He waited. It was the right call, she said. The 3 words landed with the same weight as the single word she had sent to his phone on the morning after the follow-on mission. Precise, deliberate, worth everything they cost her to say. Did you take it? He said. I accepted the proposal this morning. She looked out at the aircraft on the line. We start building the curriculum in 60 days. The first cohort comes through in 6 months. He absorbed that. It'll change things, he said. Yes. A lot of pilots. That's the intention. He looked at her profile, the same unreadable precision she presented to every situation, the same quality of attention that had first unnerved him, and then become something he recognized as one of the most valuable things he had ever had directed at him. Will you miss this? He said. The squadron, the way it is here. She was quiet for a moment. I'll miss the specific texture of it, she said. The informality, the way things happen without a formal structure behind them. She paused. But what works here works because of the thinking behind it, not the location. She looked at him. The thinking is portable. He nodded. What happens to the pilots who come through the new program? He asked. After they leave, they go to their squadrons, she said. They fly their missions. They face their own moments when the screens go dark and the answers disappear. She paused. And they either remember what they learned or they don't. How do you make sure they remember? She looked at him. You don't make sure, she said. You give them the best preparation you can. You show them the thinking, not just the product. You reach the ones who can still be reached. She paused. And then you let go. Because at some point every pilot has to fly in a sky where no one who taught them is present. That moment is the real test. Not the curriculum. Not the evaluation. The moment when it is only them and the sky and the quality of everything they've built inside themselves. He thought about 40 seconds of margin on a real egress. He thought about 1 word on a screen in a lightning morning. And the ones you can't reach, he said quietly. She was quiet for a moment. You keep trying, she said. You don't get to decide in advance who is reachable. Sometimes the arrogant ones surprise you. She glanced at him sideways, and it was so close to a dry smile that he almost missed it. Sometimes they knock on your door and ask why your cockpit is empty. He felt something warm and complicated move through his chest. I owe you more than I can account for, he said. You owe the next pilot who comes through wherever you're stationed the same quality of presence you received here, she said immediately. That's how it works. It doesn't go back. It goes forward. He stood with that. The flight line was quiet around them, and the sky above was the same sky it had always been, indifferent, demanding honest in the way that only things with no interest in your feelings can be honest. I leave for my new assignment in 3 weeks, he said. I know. Ramstein, F-16 Aggressor Squadron. Good assignment, she said. Complex environment, high tempo. You'll fly against a lot of pilots who think they already know everything. Like I did. Yes. A pause. Unlike you did, most of them won't ask the right question. What do I do when they don't? She looked at him. You wait, she said. You watch. You do your job with the kind of quality that creates a question in people who are still capable of asking one. She paused. You can't give someone a question they're not ready to receive, but you can create the conditions where the question becomes possible. He absorbed that. I thought about what it meant to carry this, not as a story about himself, not as a credential or a claim to special understanding, but as a practice. The ongoing, daily, unglamorous work of flying the actual sky. Of knowing what he didn't know, of keeping the door open to the information the environment was offering rather than the information he expected it to offer. It wasn't a destination, it was a direction, and the direction didn't end. On his last day at Aviano, Ethan walked through the hangar at 0600 before the squadron had fully arrived in the particular quiet of a place that is resting between the weight of what it has held and the weight of what it will hold next. He stopped in front of Sophia's aircraft. He looked at the cockpit. He had looked at this cockpit once before. 3 weeks and 4 days ago, on a morning that felt measured in actual experience, like a different chapter of his life. He had looked at it and seen emptiness, and laughed, and set in motion a sequence of events that had taken him apart and reassembled him into something more honest and more capable and more aware of how much he still didn't know. He looked at the cockpit now. He saw what was in it. Not visible objects, not decorations or talismans, or the accumulated personal markings that most pilots use to make their aircraft an extension of their identity. What was in it was invisible and therefore permanent. The preparation that no one saw, the contingencies that were never announced, the reasoning that had been built into the structure of the pilot who flew it until the reasoning and the pilot were indistinguishable. The 3 alternate egresses always ready. The questions always open. The discipline always present whether anyone was watching or not. The cockpit was full. He had just needed to learn how to see. Sophia's voice came from behind him. "Early," she said. He turned. She was in her flight suit helmet bag over one shoulder, walking toward her aircraft for the day's first flight. "Last day," he said. "I wanted to see it again." She stopped beside him and looked at her aircraft with the expression she had when she was confirming that something was exactly as it should be. "What do you see?" she said. "Everything that matters," he said, "and nothing that doesn't." She looked at him, and then she did something he had not seen her do once in the entire time he had known her. She smiled. Not the near smile, the almost smile, the controlled suggestion of warmth he had occasionally glimpsed. A real one. Brief and real and gone quickly, because she was too disciplined to let it stay for long. But it had been there, and he had seen it, and it told him something that all the words and all the missions and all the careful, precise language had approached, but never quite arrived at. She was proud of him, not in the sentimental sense. Not in the way that was about her, or about the instruction, or about the validation of a method. Proud in the way that someone who has given another person a real thing, not a lesson, not a credential, not a skill, but a way of seeing feels when they see that person seeing. "Take care of your wingman," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Take care of your judgment." "Yes, ma'am." "And when your screens go dark, fly the jet," he said. She looked at him one more time. Then she walked to her aircraft, climbed the ladder, and settled into the cockpit that was full of everything that mattered and nothing that didn't. He picked up his bag. He walked out of the hangar. He drove to the departure terminal in the particular early morning quiet of a decision that has been made and is now simply being lived out 1 hour at a time in whatever sky comes next. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. What she had given him didn't live at Aviano. It lived in him now in the prepared space behind every decision. In the questions he would keep asking in the sky. He would keep flying honestly and carefully, and with the respect of a person who understood that the sky did not forgive the assumption that you already knew what it would do. He carried it forward. Into Ramstein and the pilots there who didn't yet know what they didn't know. Into every formation he would lead, and every wingman he would bring home. Into every mission where the screens went dark, and the only thing left was the person inside the cockpit and the quality of everything they had built inside themselves when no one was watching. He carried it the way Sophia had carried her 58 minutes, not as a story, not as a trophy, not as a credential to display when the conversation turned to who had been tested and how. Quietly. Completely. Available, not merely known. Because that was the difference. Because that had always been the difference. Because in the end, after the technology and the doctrine and the assessment and the recognition had all said what they had to say, what remained in the cockpit, what was always in the cockpit, whether you could see it or not, was the human being who had prepared for the moment. They couldn't predict, and when that moment came, had simply precisely without drama or doubt or any need for the world to acknowledge it, done the job. That was what the cockpit held. That was what it had always held. And now, for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole knew exactly how to fill one.